Dr. Martyn Beaven, Senior Lecturer at Waikato University, New Zealand. Originally, Dr. Martyn graduated with a degree in chemistry from Waikato University, worked with Dr. Christian Cook and Dr. Nick Gill in the use of electrosonophoresis to assess muscle damage and hormone responses to training as a part of his postgraduate work at the Waikato Institute of Technology. He went on to complete his PhD through the Auckland University of Technology under the supervision of Professor Will Hopkins and Doctors Nick Gill and John Ingram. The PhD was sponsored by the New Zealand Rugby Union and looked into the hormonal underpinnings of adaptation. He then moved to Sweden to complete a 2-year postdoc at the National Winter Sports Center, where he was assigned the role of heading the exercise physiology testing facility and worked as a recovery consultant to the Swedish Olympic Committee during the London 2012 Olympics. At the completion of the postdoc, he moved to the Nebraska Athletic Performance Laboratory at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, as the lead physiologist, where he had the opportunity to work with a range of diverse sports. In 2015, he was offered the role of head of strength and conditioning for the Malaysian National Sports Institute in Kuala Lumpur, overseeing both the Olympic and Paralympics programs leading to Rio 2016 and culminating in Malaysia's most successful ever contingent, including their first gold medal. He is now a senior lecturer at the University of Waikato Adams Centre for High Performance, the home base for the world champion New Zealand men's and women's sevens rugby teams. He has worked with both able-bodied and disabled elite athletes in various sports, including athletics, badminton, basketball, bowling, cycling, diving, football, golf, gymnastics, hockey, ice hockey, martial arts, netball, ping pong, rugby union, rugby league, rifle shooting, sailing, squash, swimming, synchronized swimming, tennis, volleyball, water skiing, wrestling, and yachting. His research interests are varied from the individualization of training programs based on hormone responses, hormonal priming, competitive readiness, recovery interventions, overspeed training, and eccentrics, heat acclimatization, ergogenic effects of mouth rinsing, occlusion training and ischemic preconditioning, caffeine, electrostimulation, biorhythms, unexpected disturbance programs, and the non-imaging forming effects of short wavelength light on human well-being and performance. Overall, its research background has focused on understanding how individuals respond to various exercise stimuli and striving to maximize adaptation and recovery through knowledge of underlying physiology. That includes targeting innovative and scientific approaches to all aspects of physiology, nutrition, and technology integration. His wife, Dr. Kim, is also a sports scientist, and she too is working in the same university as a lead biomechanist. We will be having Q&A session at the end of his presentation. Kindly type the questions in the chat box if you would like to ask. Now I welcome Dr. Martyn to deliver his lecture on sports training and biochemical monitoring. Over to Dr. Martyn.
Thank you for your very kind introduction, Dr. Saju. And yes, obviously, I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Saju during my time in Malaysia at the National Sports Institute. And yeah, it's quite a list of sports when you write it down. And I think I'm only really missing a few letters from the alphabet. I'm trying to find a sport that starts with Z to add on to the list there. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a bit of a presentation, but I want to thank everybody that has taken their time to come in and listen. I do really appreciate it. And I hope that you are all safe and well in these uncertain times. Okay.
Are you able to share the screen? Okay, yeah.
So Do you see the presentation now, Dr. Saju?
Yeah, yeah.
Excuse me 1 second. So, yes, as Dr. Saju mentioned, I have been around the world a little bit after doing some training and working quite a lot with rugby and doing my PhD in New Zealand, subsequent to a chemistry degree. I decided to basically travel as far as you can away from New Zealand and made my way to the National Vintersportcentrum in Östersund in Sweden, where I worked, did my postdoc for 2 years. After that, I had the opportunity to move to Lincoln, Nebraska, which is almost exactly in the middle of America. You couldn't be further away from the ocean if you tried. It's almost the exact middle of America. Lovely people there and an amazing facility that they had. As Dr. Saju said, after that, I had the privilege of working in Malaysia and working with some of the amazing athletes and para-athletes that they had at the time, leading into the Rio Olympic Games, which was a real highlight of my career, working with you know, some of those athletes like Rizwan Puzi, who won the gold medal in the 100 meters, Latif Romli, the triple jump, and also Zihad Zolfeki, who won another strength and power sport. So it made me feel quite good, although I only had a very, very small part to play in their success. Obviously, those people that were strength and power athletes and spent a lot of time in the jungle gym, as we called it in Malaysia. And now, yes, I have moved back to my home country of New Zealand, a lovely part of New Zealand, actually, that's called the Bay of Plenty, and there's a good reason that it's called the Bay of Plenty. It is a beautiful spot right by the beach, and I definitely would love to hear from any of you afterwards. If you obviously after the COVID pandemic hopefully subsides, we'd love to host any of you to come and visit us in this wonderful part of the world. I do want to say that it is really, for me, I'm going to talk a bit about my research, and if you want to get a greater understanding of monitoring in athletes, there's some amazing resources out there and some amazing researchers that have done some phenomenal work in the area. I'd refer you to this Olympic textbook of medicine and sport, which has a fantastic chapter by Inigo Mujica, Professor Mujica, and Shona Holson, and the models of fatigue that they present there, with the inputs of fatigue and training and the output of performance that they talk through there. There's also a chapter by Professor John Hawley, which is amazing. And Overtraining Syndrome by Romain Musin, and I'll actually present a little bit of his work because I really think it was some very impressive work that he has done in this area. On top of the other two books there, the Monitoring and Training by Mike McGuigan, another Kiwi, so I guess I have to try and support my fellow New Zealanders, and Tapering and Peaking, another great book, again by Inigo Mujica. Really is an outstanding researcher in this area around tapering and peaking for optimal performance, and how monitoring and being aware of both the external and internal load is an integral part of that process. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. I will talk briefly about why we should be monitoring, or why would you want to monitor, what we monitor and what we can monitor. And then I'll move on to obviously the main topic of today's sport talk around the biochemical monitoring. If we think about why to monitor, I think it really does come back to having a providing a scientific explanation for why we see changes in performance, and having a systematic way of assessing this dose response. When we give a certain load or a certain type of training, what outcomes are we expecting to see? And that's not as simple as just measuring the load, because there is the internal load and how the body is interpreting that load and how it is capable of responding to that training stimulus. That makes it much more of an art form than it's never going to be an exact science, unfortunately, with monitoring. But one of the key things is trying to quantify that load as best we can to enable us to be able to, at some level, predict how effective our training is going to be. And by being able to quantify our load and look at this dose response, or what happens in response to a given load in a given individual, then we can build up our perception and optimize our training moving forward with that given individual, and start to hopefully see trends where we can apply things to sets of or groups of people as well. I think we probably all have a really good understanding of this sort of general adaptation syndrome, first proposed by Saley in, I think it was in the early 30s now, where you have this stress, and there's this recovery area and this sort of super compensation. And if we are continually training and optimizing our training stimulus, and hopefully optimizing that recovery period as well, hopefully you see some sort of trend like this, where we're building on top of those given training sessions and seeing an improvement over time. So those, say, trying to time these subsequent training sessions to take advantage of the super compensation, or this overshoot that we see subsequent to training. And quite often what you'd see is you'd maybe monitor early on at the start of a microcycle or a training block, and then monitor again, do some sort of testing, standardized testing again at the end of the block. That's probably what we're used to seeing, but at some level you almost want to be trying to monitor throughout a microcycle or over the period of training, to ensure that we're being effective and safe. Those are probably two of the underlying key attributes of our training protocol, that we want them to be both safe and effective. Obviously, by monitoring here as well, we can also see, hopefully give motivation to the athletes as they see progress moving forwards, and maybe even reinforce the good behaviors that are occurring that they can directly link to improvements that are occurring over time. So again, those two key aspects, and I'll come back to those time and time again, of when we're prescribing exercise, when we are giving an athlete a training program, then the underlying mantra is that they need to be effective and safe. So if we do apply a training load and we can be quite effective, maybe we do see some good gains in terms of our ability to produce power, or run faster, jump higher, but we start to see a lot of injuries as a result of that type of training, then obviously it's effective but not being safe. Or we do start to see an increase in staleness or non-functional overreaching, then we want to make sure that we are aware of that as soon as possible, so that we can intervene to try and prevent any sort of maladaptation that can occur as we move too far along that spectrum. Obviously, we do need to create a given stress, so we do need to move some distance along that spectrum into functional overreaching, but where that threshold is of the difference between functional overreaching and non-functional overreaching, and then overtraining, is really, I think what everyone agrees is that there isn't really one number that we can rely on in terms of assessing that. There isn't one biochemical marker that we can look at. There isn't necessarily any of the other tools that we have in our toolkit to assess training load, whether that's internal or external, that will give us the answer to that. So that's where the art of coaching really does still exist, and where the sports scientists are trying to provide as much information as possible, but will never really be able to give a definitive answer, I don't think. So I've talked about this dose response. We want to be able to quantify or at some level have a scientific explanation of the loading that we're providing and the outcome that occurs as a result of it. An additional level of complexity over that is that not everybody responds to a given training load in the same way. They may well have an entirely different recovery profile. They may have the persistence of the benefits of that adaptation that they have may well be longer for one individual versus another individual that may need additional loading to maintain or continue to improve. And I like to put up this this graph here. This is some work by Claude Bouchard and Rankinen. It's from a few years ago now, but it's from the Heritage study, where they did a study over 20 weeks. These individuals were training 3 times a week, and the intention was that they were trying to improve their aerobic fitness. And what you can see is that the mean response, they absolutely achieved that. I think on average, most of the people probably doubled their ability to utilize oxygen or their aerobic fitness. But what you see at this end of the curve here is that there were a proportion of people, not a very large proportion of people, but there were people that were training 3 times a week for 20 weeks to improve their aerobic fitness that actually lost aerobic fitness. So when we are monitoring, and that's why I talked about the ideal monitoring, where we track individuals throughout the training program rather than just get to the end of 20 weeks and discover that for some individuals our intervention has been very, not just ineffective, but actually been quite harmful in terms of trying to achieve the goals that we were trying to achieve. So it's really does come back to that individual response, and that's was almost the basis of some of my PhD work around the work we did with testosterone and cortisol responses to resistance training, where we found that the expected outcomes from prescribing a hypertrophy type session or a strength type session held true for the majority of people, but they didn't hold true for every individual. And at the same time, when we were assessing those hormonal responses to exercise, and I know those acute responses to exercise are a source of some debate currently, but what we saw was that they were actually quite closely linked to our ability to respond to a given exercise stimulus. Another reason to monitor is just to enable appropriate planning. And this comes back to a lot of Inigo Majika's work again around peaking and tapering and understanding how the interaction between fatigue and our training can be manipulated to peak for a given event, or make sure that we're keeping our volume and intensity at appropriate levels when we're trying to prepare and peak for a given event. It also helps us know what the real load that the athlete is experiencing. At some level, sometimes the coaches are prescribing a given training, and they may think it's actually quite an easy training, whereas if you are doing monitoring and getting some sort of TRIMP, so some sort of RPE times duration times this intensity coefficient, you'll actually find that some of the athletes are finding those easy trainings quite tough, and potentially vice versa. There'll be trainings that are designed to be difficult and taxing that athletes aren't necessarily finding difficult. So it really is a case of quantifying what the athletes are actually performing and how they're coping with that versus what's actually been planned maybe in your periodized plan. And another big thing that probably gets overlooked a little bit with monitoring is this relationship building. One of my PhD supervisors there, Nick Gill, is the head strength conditioning coach for the All Blacks. He and I just written a chapter in this book, Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training. And in there, he talks about how not keeping an eye on your players and how they move and picking up signs of obvious movement competency is, or a lack of competency, is actually pure neglect. So you don't want to just be relying on that one number that you're collecting with your monitoring, but you do want to be interacting with your athletes, asking them how they're doing, watching how they're moving, watching how they're behaving, and that rapport and the relationship that you can build with your athletes through doing that is actually probably an overlooked benefit of that type of monitoring. Just a bit of a survey here. It was across some high performance programs by Chrissy Taylor. It's a few years old now, 2012. But basically those key reasons for monitoring across these high performance programs, the number one was injury prevention, monitoring the effectiveness coming in at a close second with 27%, maintaining performance and preventing overtraining, coming in at 22% there. So all of these reasons that we're going to talk through, the vital reasons for monitoring, and I think we'll come back a few times to say you can't just rely on one number to monitor. It is a case of having to understand the athlete a little bit more holistically. And even when we are looking at things like TRIMP and quantifying that training load, there's so many other undefinables. When we're putting things like travel for our athletes on top of that additional stress, there's even things that are going on at home. If your young son is up all night vomiting like my son was last night, then it's an additional load that you're not necessarily going to capture just through getting an RPE and multiplying it by duration and an intensity coefficient at the end of a training session. So what can we monitor? This is a great paper that came out. It was published in Sports Med by Shona Holson. I've mentioned her already, a fantastic Australian researcher, so it does actually pain me to give some credit to the Australians, but a fantastic article and well worth reading. But a lot of these variables that she presents here are things that actually you don't need a lot of equipment to perform. If we're looking at frequency, time, intensity there, all of these things we can measure pretty easily with a limited amount of technology. Yes, the biochemistry and hormone analysis that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is probably one of the ones that falls outside that region. There is obviously specialist equipment required to do that. But at some level, that I want you to take away that monitoring is not necessarily just using all the latest tools. It is a case of tracking how things are going with your athletes and really trying to understand exactly what you are presenting your athlete with in terms of the load and how that is being translated into performance. And that internal load that they're experiencing is probably sort of that intermediary that gets overlooked a little bit. So when we're talking about internal versus external load, the external load is just this objective measure of the work being completed by an athlete. So that's the watts they're producing, it's the time it's taking them, or the speed that they're running at. Whereas internal load is the relative physiological or psychological stress that's associated with that. And that can be very different. So two athletes can have the same external load, but the internal load can be very different. If I try and run at 18 kilometers per hour, my heart rate is going to be much, much higher than somebody who's a well-trained middle distance athlete. So the external load, the speed we're going will be the same, but the stress that it's placing on me, and therefore probably the amount of recovery and the amount of training stimulus that's being applied is very, very different. So yeah, just being aware that the external load and the internal load do not necessarily line up. And it's probably a case, you could say, that when there is this disassociation between an internal load and the external load, that might be starting to be a bit of a warning sign that the athlete is struggling to cope with a given load. So if you can normally go out running at 18 kilometers per hour for a period of time with a heart rate, so that internal load of, say, around 140, and then you go through a heavy block of training, you are out running, you can still perform your training block at that 18 kilometers an hour, but now your heart rate is much higher. It's 155, it's 160. You're getting this disassociation between the normal state and this sort of starting to be move along the spectrum towards sort of an overreaching, overtraining. So this disassociation there between the internal and external load can be a bit of a warning sign for overtraining. In the same paper there, Shona also talks a lot about, we've touched on the why we should be monitoring and what we can monitor, but the frequency of the monitoring is also very important in terms of having athlete buy-in. If they're being asked the same questions over and over again, then you start to lose the athlete's belief that the questions are being used in a valuable way, and how the data is interpreted and presented back to the athlete and the coach is very important as well. But I think so. A couple of things there. Obviously, you can have the best monitoring system in the world. You can have the best biochemistry lab in the world. It's actually not going to be directly linked to performance, unfortunately. Even if you do monitor everything perfectly, there are so many things that occur at high level sport that you're never going to necessarily be able to say, well, our values are all within the perfect zone, so we may as well not bother having this race or playing this game today, because we're just going to give the gold medal straight to this team because of the values that we've measured in the lab. That's never going to be the case. And there's always the aspect of the data you use or that you collect needs to be used to implement change. It needs to inform decision making. If you are collecting data and it isn't being used to inform your decision making, whether it's for the session you have in 30 minutes, or it's the session you have tomorrow, or even if it's a session that you maybe have planned out in your periodized plan 2 or 3 months in advance, if you are monitoring and collecting data that you are not using to inform decisions, future decisions, then there's no reason to be monitoring or collecting that data. I'm just going to touch on a couple of those things that Shona had listed before we get into the biochemical monitoring. And one of them is Swedish research. Obviously, I was based in Sweden for a while, so I did have the opportunity to talk with Kalman, who is an amazing researcher in this area. And this is some research from back in the sort of mid-90s. And they were just asking the POMS questionnaire. And if it's quite a few questions, 65 words that you have to respond to. But if you've ever been around someone who is overtraining, you've probably find that they're not particularly friendly. Sometimes they're a little bit unhappy or grumpy. This you can see here, this is extremely angry. So you do get these instances of behavioral changes with overtraining. And what they found was, by monitoring the POMS, that none of their athletes moving into an Olympic cycle developed any signs of staleness. So that was one tool that they were using to try and prevent any non-functional overreaching or overtraining. There's a really interesting study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2016. The lead author there is Saw, and the direct quote from them there was, so this is a reasonably recent study here. It's a review article. Subjective measures reflected acute and chronic training loads with superior sensitivity and consistency than any other objective measure. So again, if you are not asking your athletes how they are feeling, gathering that subjective information, then you really are missing a trick. You probably should be, it's probably one of the key things to be tracking. And obviously with subjective measures like that, really all you need is a pen and paper. So there's no real expense associated with that type of monitoring. If we look at heart rate monitoring now, and obviously most athletes and even most of the general population these days have watches that will tell them their heart rate recovery, even their heart rate variability. There's plenty of evidence out there now, and I remember listening to a talk by Inigo Mjika on monitoring himself, where he talked about that a slight increase in intensity across a season, or that the small increase in intensity across a season was associated with better adaptive gains. And we can see that in this study here by Jaspers. Essentially the amount of time they spent at these higher intensities, so a little bit different to what Professor Inigo Mjika was talking about, but they also saw a link between this time you spent at high intensities and changes in aerobic fitness across a pre-season in these professional soccer players. There's also some pretty interesting information in, this is elite cyclists now, looking at the heart rate recovery. So just looking at how much the heart rate drops at the end of a high intensity interval session. So saying, so after that final interval, how much does the heart rate drop 60 seconds after they finish exercise? And basically what they saw was that as they progressed through, so they did 8 high intensity training sessions in total, and as they moved through, the fitness improved, the change in that recovery, so they dropped a greater number of beats per minute, so indicative of aerobic fitness. There was a group of athletes that continued to increase, so they continued to improve the whole way through. So that's this G increase group. But the other group here that you can see is a bit of a U shape, or an upside down U shape. Basically, they did track pretty well for 5 or 6 sessions, but in the 7th and 8th session, there seems to be this, again, this disconnect between the external measure and the internal measure. So they're still able to complete the high intensity training, but that internal measure of heart rate, you're not seeing the same level of recovery. Their heart rate recovery basically dropped back to a similar level to what you saw before they'd even started training. And what they saw there was that even though both of those groups improved their relative peak power, only the group that continually improved that measure of heart rate recovery improved their key performance metric, which was a 40-kilometer time trial. Heart rate variability, another one as well, which is touted as being giving us a lot of information around that, the activation of our autonomic nervous system and that balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. There's some research done in New Zealand. Again, maybe I'm a little bit biased presenting this type of data, but just 2 athletes here. You see one triathlete, the variability in their heart rate was pretty consistent across a training block and leading into an important event for that individual. Whereas they had another athlete that really struggled with the training load, was diagnosed with non-functional overreaching, actually developed shingles, which is an immunosuppressive and indicative of chronic fatigue. And what you see is that the amount of variability that they had in their heart rate was actually falling quite drastically, and they actually weren't able to complete their key event. So another tool potentially that we have, and again, probably the type of thing that a lot of athletes actually have on their wrists already. And one final thing, this is some work that one of my PhD students just sent to me a couple of days ago. So it really is very new. It hasn't been published yet, but Captain Dave Edgar is working with me, and we're doing some work monitoring sleep in some of our military recruits. So we have a group of military recruits that are trying to get to become officers, and they have to go through a 6-week training block. And they have to pass all of these physical tests. And one of the tests they do at the start and at the end is a 2.4K run. and then they do you know, how many press ups can they do as well. And what we saw when we monitored their sleep, so they just had actigraph watches on their wrists, and that we could split them into the group that slept longer. So we basically just split the group in half. They actually, both groups didn't sleep a hell of a lot. They're in the army, they sort of get woken up pretty early, and there's a lot of training going on, and I'm sure you can appreciate that over there in India with the time spent in the army there as well. But what we did see is that the people that slept more actually improved much better. So in that 2 kilometer run, the improvements in the group that slept more, our overs group, they improved 60 seconds. So the difference of 15 seconds was actually clear. And in terms of press ups, they actually improved an extra 1.5 reps over that 6 weeks. So, and again, that was only a small difference, but it was a clear difference. So just sleeping more. So if we monitor our sleep and can identify people that are sleeping poorly, we may actually be able to have a positive impact on training effectiveness. So I think you're probably about time for me to start talking about what you asked me to talk about, which was the biochemical monitoring. And I've pulled up this review from 2018 by Greenham, and basically what they've said is that, you know, there are a large number of biomarkers and biochemicals that have been assessed, and people have tried to align them with performance gains and performance decrements, so both, you know, tracking effective training, but also that type of training that may well be having a negative impact in terms of the non-functional overreaching. What they said is that there really isn't a lot out there that's been shown to be effective. There's neutrophil counts, circulating glutamine, urea concentrations, and this testosterone cortisol ratio are probably the only things that would be recommended from a biochemical monitoring perspective from this review. And they do go on to say that you probably should focus more on the individual than groups, just because of the large individual variability that tends to be associated with the responses to this sort of external load. And I guess I got really, really lucky there, because when I started doing my PhD, I was monitoring testosterone and cortisol in athletes. So if I'd gone down a different route, I probably wouldn't have found anywhere near the interesting data that we did with our rugby athletes. And one of the things that we were very keen on, and I'll present data on the next slide, is just the individual differences rather than looking at the group as a whole. So this is some data from my first postgraduate honours paper here, and essentially what we did, we got our whole rugby team to either perform 4 sets of 10 at 70% of 1RM, so what would be considered a typical hypertrophy type session, 3x5 at 85%, so what would be considered a typical strength type session, a 5x15 at a lower load, so more of a strength endurance type session, and then a power session, so a very light load, 3 sets of 5, trying to throw the bar, being very ballistic and powerful. And what we saw in terms of our testosterone responses was that we sort of had these groups of people that responded to hypertrophy, strength endurance, and even power in terms of the absolute change in free testosterone or salivary testosterone. And the interesting thing was that the group that responded very well to the hypertrophy type sessions always responded terribly to a power type session. And the athletes that responded terribly to a hypertrophy type session tended to respond really well to a power session. And I can hear you all the way from India saying, so what? You know, what does that really mean? Well, actually what we were able to show in a different group of athletes, but they were still well-trained rugby athletes, was that if we assigned them to a protocol that was associated with the maximal increase in acute testosterone, we saw rather impressive gains in strength and in body mass. If we assigned them to a session that was their worst response in terms of the change in salivary testosterone, then actually they didn't gain any strength at all. In some cases, they actually started going backwards, and you could see they actually started to lose muscle mass. So it starts to give us this idea of maybe you have those athletes that tend to be hard gainers, or people that go to the gym and don't see results very quickly. Maybe there's an underlying reason where some of the the FIT guidelines or the ACSM guidelines about what we should be doing, the types of training load that we should be imposing to achieve hypertrophy, those increases in cross-sectional area, might not necessarily hold true across a large section of the population. So as you see here, the T-Max protocol is a protocol designed to elicit a large amount of testosterone, effective in gains, and you see a negative when we went to the protocol that didn't produce much testosterone. And it was actually a crossover. So we did have a group of athletes that were on their T minimum protocol first. So they actually started to lose strength initially. And after the crossover, we see an increase in that group. Whereas the group that was on the protocol designed to increase testosterone initially, we see this increase, but then that falls away after the crossover when we change over to that protocol that wasn't producing as much testosterone. Interestingly, we did retest all of the athletes to see if this was a consistent response, if they were consistently a hypertrophy type responder, and it was consistent across 13 of the 16 athletes that we tested. So this gives us an idea, and we talked about those two key things that we want to be really clear on around it, training being safe and effective. This gives us a way of monitoring individual athletes so that we can try and optimize our effectiveness if we're trying to gain strength and cross-sectional area. This is a pretty similar sort of study. Again, it was done with a professional rugby franchise in New Zealand here. And essentially what we did, we had two types of session now. We had a strength type session. So the change in testosterone that we saw with the strength type session is the y-axis here. And the change in testosterone we saw in the speed type session, or the velocity type session, is the x-axis here. So I guess what we can see here is that for the majority of the players, when they did a strength type session, we saw a good increase in testosterone across that session. When we did a velocity type session, there was quite a few individuals that also had a positive response in terms of testosterone to that type of session. And you can see there's sort of the lucky few up here that respond to both of those types of session. And these ones down here, you can see they only really responded to the velocity type session, and when they were doing the strength type session, you actually see a decrease in testosterone. The interesting thing we saw there was if we looked at the cortisol data, which is the data below here, which is exactly the same here, and the increase in cortisol in response to the strength session is on the y-axis, the increase in cortisol to the velocity session is on the x-axis. The three individuals that responded very, very well to the velocity type session were the same three individuals that responded or had a very low cortisol response when we did the strength type session. So again, just gives us an idea of these distinct groups of responders, and just might be able to mean that we can tweak our type of training through understanding and monitoring these biochemical markers here, being able to understand those individuals and hopefully be a little bit more effective in our training program. There's some other work that we performed with a team in the UK now, and the primary reason for looking at this data here, so the primary aim was actually looking at giving our athletes caffeine to see if that would help to ameliorate or to slow the decline or the decrease in performance that we saw with a lack of sleep. We've sort of seen previously the importance of sleep, and here I think it's very clear. If we look across we had three types of exercise they did: the bench press, the squat, and the bent over row. So the bench press, the volume that they were able to do on a given day, squat and the bent over row, and then the total volume they were able to do on a given day. The difference between a sleep deprived individual, so someone that slept less than 6 hours, and someone that slept 8 hours was about 1400 kg. So that's about the weight of a small car, that they lifted more in one session just because of a poor sleep. Really does bring home that actually that stimulus, so the cumulative stimulus that you are going to build up over time by coming into the gym. You're trying to improve your ability to produce force. If you are not sleeping well, then you are really robbing yourself of a very, very large potential benefit there. But one thing I did want to say there was we were also doing some biochemical monitoring, and when we, in the non-sleep deprived state, so the people that were getting more than 8 hours sleep, our testosterone levels were higher and our cortisol levels were lower. So when we're thinking about testosterone and cortisol giving us some idea of this anabolic catabolic ratio, it really does drive home the fact that the biochemistry and the monitoring there is having an important effect. And actually what we saw, we were giving the caffeine pills or placebo pills 60 minutes before the training session. What we saw is that the change in testosterone across that 60 minutes, the greater the increase in testosterone across that 60 minutes, the greater the weight that was lifted by that person subsequently. So the majority of people probably only increased maybe around 5%, but even that it was morning training, so it was probably counteracting some of the normal circadian rhythm you would see with a fall in testosterone. But people that were increasing by about 10% were lifting around 2 tons more weight in the gym on a given day. 15%, you're almost out to 3 tons more, and that's an additional adaptive stimulus that you're hoping to will translate across into performance gains. This is some work we did with blood flow restriction training. We had 20 rugby athletes again. They were doing blood flow restriction training on their lower body only across a pre-season period. And what we saw was that our gains in our blood flow restriction group were probably around double what we saw in a group that wasn't using blood flow restriction in terms of 1RM squat, counter movement jump, maximal power, 40-meter sprint times. This is across only 3 weeks. And the interesting thing was that there's evidence of remote effects because we saw this basically a doubling of the adaptive response, or doubling of the adaptive gains in bench press as well, remembering that the blood flow restriction, those tourniquets were only being applied to the legs. So it's having a remote effect. And what we were able to show was that testosterone was a pretty good biomarker again to demonstrate the superior effectiveness of blood flow restriction training. Cortisol response was quite high also, but it tended to subside as we moved through the training. And again, we saw this relationship between the testosterone response across the training period and just how much weight or how much improvement we saw in those given individuals. There's another piece of work, and I'm just putting it up here because this is actually in females now. So what we have here is the bench press, back squat, and med ball throw performance in our female athletes. And essentially what we did, when they came in on the first day of training, we said that the testosterone that they presented with on that day was 100%. So what we could see with our bench press and our back squat was that if they came in with higher levels of testosterone, then their ability to perform the bench press and the back squat, or the amount that they moved or lifted, were increased also. If they came in with lower levels, then their ability to, that training stimulus was impacted as well. So again, some pretty interesting evidence or compelling evidence around the importance of testosterone, maybe in terms of a motivational or permissive action of testosterone, but also maybe some behavioral and aspects there as well, and or even thinking about it in terms of a readiness to perform, giving us some sort of handle on that. It sort of gave us an idea of or a concept of hormonal priming. So if we could manipulate hormones prior to them coming into the gym, would that have some sort of effect? And there's some work here from Christian Cook and Blair Cruther showing if you show athletes videos prior to going into the gym. So they had a control video. I think it was just watching a nature show. There was a sad video where they were watching starving children. There was an erotic video, a humorous video. I think it was the Big Bang Theory, an aggressive video, and a video closely linked to rugby and the training that they do in rugby. You could see that the people actually, the testosterone changed with those videos. And you actually saw that people lifted heavier weights. So their 3RM, so their ability to lift heavy weights, was actually much higher when they were shown an aggressive video or a training video. And I haven't put the information up, but it was linked to the testosterone response to those videos. This is some unpublished work from a rugby team that I've done some work with. They were in a tournament type situation. And what we saw on a Wednesday before a game, they had a standardized session and we would measure testosterone and cortisol responses to that session. And what you can see here in the week before a win, which happened to be a quarterfinal of this tournament, we saw a big increase in testosterone. Cortisol dropped down slightly, so this testosterone cortisol ratio was quite positive in terms of the response to that training session. Whereas the following week, which we lost a semi-final, and we're very sad about that in New Zealand still, quite a different hormonal profile. So the testosterone barely increased and cortisol definitely increased in that same session. So it was performed on the same day, a few days before the game. And I'm sure you could say, well, that's just one game. It's just a one-off. What does it really mean? Well, it's actually been replicated subsequently in both rugby league and in rugby, showing that this, at least in terms of testosterone, the change in testosterone to a session well before the game, so probably 2 or 3 days prior to a game, quite different before a win and a loss. So now it gives us an idea of this concept of readiness to compete, or just the recovery state of the body. If it's unable to produce these release testosterone in response to these standardized sessions, then it's unlikely that you're in a good state to go into that almost warlike competitive arena that is a rugby union game. And this is the article from Romain Musin that I mentioned earlier. It's a really impressive piece of work. It really does show that that when the body is in this overtrained state or struggling to cope with a given training load, then the biochemical markers do track that to some extent. And this is, excuse me, shows them going into a camp, and what they were asked to do is to perform an exhaustive test on a bike. I think they started at 80 watts and increased by 40 watts every minute until they were exhausted. And they looked at the adrenocorticotropic hormone response to that exhaustive exercise. And then, unfortunately for the athletes, they had to come back 4 hours later and do exactly the same test to exhaustion. And what they saw is that pre-camp, when they hadn't had much of a training load, they were pretty fresh, they were well and truly able to still have that subsequent biochemical response or hormonal response to that second session. After the camp, not so much. They had obviously a lot of training volume during the camp, and there were individuals, so that's the open squares here, that really struggled and was subsequently diagnosed with overtraining symptoms or overtraining, and they had almost a flat line response to that second session. So it gives us this concept of how biochemical monitoring can be used as this sign of readiness or ability to cope with a given load. And this is there's also some data from a rugby team that they went on a 4-week tour overseas. In the first couple of weeks here, we were taking hormonal measures most day in terms of testosterone and cortisol, and you could see they were sort of tracking up pretty much parallel to one another for the majority of the first 2 weeks. We sort of got to a point where testosterone started falling away and cortisol continued to increase, and that we didn't know it at the time. All of the information was analysed retrospectively, unfortunately, but that really did precede quite a drastic drop in our testosterone levels to well under where we were when we got off the plane initially, arriving in the UK, and it took us a few days to get back to sort of anywhere near the baseline levels that we had earlier. So I know there's some really interesting work from Professor Mujika as well, where they've sort of talked about the relationship between testosterone and cortisol, and the volume decreases in a taper. So a positive relationship between this testosterone cortisol ratio and performance. And it really does, I think, highlight that potentially this is one area where we can get a bit of a handle on how a given athlete is coping with a given load. And obviously this is just in terms of standard training, but there are obviously biochemical markers, and I won't go into them today because I'm aware that we're running on time here, but there are biomarkers that you can look at to inform adaptations to altitude and heat acclimation adaptations as well, which is something we've become pretty interested in New Zealand, obviously, with the now delayed Tokyo Olympics being described as likely to be the hottest Olympics ever. And here's just another sort of example here, this time in rugby league, where we're looking at creatine kinase, so that enzyme that's in our muscles, and if it's out in our bloodstream, it basically means there's been some sort of structural damage to our musculoskeletal system. And sort of this inverse relationship or reciprocal relationship between creatine kinase, so very, very large increase in creatine kinase as a result of a rugby league game with all of those collisions, and the recovery in creatine kinase across 7 days post-game. You can see it never really gets back to baseline, and the reciprocal in terms of our testosterone cortisol ratio. So it drops very, very low post-game and only really recovers in those sort of 3, 5, 7 days post-game. What's going on here? Sorry, I'm not sure what's happened here. Oh, there we go. Happened all in one go. So again, this is some other work that I did, just looking at creatine kinase and using that as a monitoring tool to look at the effectiveness of our recovery strategies after rugby games. And what we saw was that active recovery, so just getting on a bike and having very low wattage around 100 watts for 5 minutes after a game, was actually just as effective as going into contrast water therapy baths or wearing compression garments overnight. The passive recovery, so your standard refuel and rehydrate, wasn't nearly as effective in terms of recovery out at 84 hours post-game. So a summary slide. I'm sure you're all glad that we're getting to the end here, and want to really thank you for coming along and listening. But so hopefully we've sort of touched on these questions here. Why should we be monitoring? What should we be monitoring? And just a bit of an idea on some of those biochemical tools that we have as well, or the information that can be used for in terms of guiding, just individualizing our training to make sure our training is effective, looking at motivation and training readiness, potentially even looking at the dose sufficiency of whether caffeine might work. Really does help to assist with athlete education. It was one of the key things in that sleep study where we could show people that their testosterone was poor, or if they weren't eating well prior to training, their testosterone levels were lower. Then that even it gave the even people that don't really understand testosterone too much and know that probably more is better for a rugby player or for a strength and power athlete. So it really did help us to drill home some of those key messages around sleeping well and eating well, fueling well for training. Like I said, we can look at the recovery states as well, and also look at potentially some of the effectiveness of priming strategies leading into training. So this is where I am now in Mount Maunganui, and I just wanted to say, Dunyavad, thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martyn, for the wonderful presentation. It was indeed very informative, and I'm sure that your presentation would have benefited and have given some insights to our coaches. Now I open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please do type in the chat box. Yeah, I will read out to Dr. Martyn and he would give you a feedback on that. Meanwhile, I think Dr. Martyn, have you done any testing, biochemical testing with eccentric exercise? If you have any experience of any eccentric exercise testing?
It's a good question, and no, we haven't really done anything with eccentric training. It's obviously a very different training modality, and it seems to be very, very effective in terms of increasing muscle size and probably increasing our muscle fibers in parallel rather than in series like we're used to. But I haven't actually had any experience of looking at those differential hormonal responses. There's obviously very wildly different muscle damage markers in response to eccentric training, but I haven't done any work with either testosterone or cortisol, no.
Any questions?
So Raju sir, the participants can unmute themselves and they can ask the question.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please. Anyone?
Dr. Saju.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. This is Dr. Stalin. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Martyn, Beaven, you made a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And on behalf of all the participants, our sincere thanks to you as well as Sports Authority of India for making this amazing initiative. I have made questions there in the chat box to you personally as well as to Sai Bangalore. 3 questions I typed it. Anyhow, if you're not get it, I can ask you now. You mentioned about the load. So when you're mentioning about the load, in sports, there are sports which are having off-season sports, and some sports are there's no off-season at all. Around the clock, around the year they play. So in that case, you mentioned about the external overload monitoring as well as internal overload monitoring. So in these two, which one is very dangerous? And for the internal overload, do you have any tool to measure it?
Yes, so thank you for your very kind words, Dr. Stalin. Yeah, it's a very good question. You talked about the off-season training and how do we monitor load in an off-season. It becomes problematic. I know the acute-chronic ratio has received a lot of attention with coaches and has received a little bit of a negative attention as well recently from, say, Impellizzeri and say Aaron Coots and even Martyn Boucher there at PSG saying, well, it's actually really difficult to get worthwhile data from that because of the fact that when they are out of season, you know, by definition, the chronic loading is going to be very low. So when they come back into training, it's impossible to keep the acute chronic ratio within whatever green zone. When we talk about monitoring our internal loading, I think probably the main ones there realistically are heart rate. We're looking at all of those biomarkers that we've looked at in terms of testosterone, ACTH, are internal markers as well. But like I said, it comes back to this, sometimes there's this mismatch between how hard our body is perceiving something. So even RPE is an internal loading tool that we all have access to. So it's probably the easiest way of assessing internal load is those subjective measures. And like we said, that they're actually really powerful as well.
Doctor, don't you think internal overload is also consist of psychological stresses?
100%, yes, yeah.
Then
So,
how do we measure it?
So there are some tools like the POMS, the Profile of Mood State questionnaire that I put forward there. We've used the positive and negative effect schedule, the PANAS, as well to try and get an idea. But a lot of the times now we have had to try and actually really understand ourselves. What are we trying to get information on? Because some of those questionnaires are very long. The PANAS is like 64 questions, the POMS 36, even the short version. So what we ended up needing to do was make sure that the athletes understood what the questions were, and B, why were we asking the questions? And what we ended up doing was really working out which one of those variables was sensitive to performance, because at the end of the day, the reason for monitoring is to try and get this understanding between our training load and what the training load we're putting, or the stress we're putting on the athlete, and hopefully positive adaptations that we're seeing. So it really did come back to understanding that at some level and seeing what the differences were there. Does that make some sense?
See, Doctor, we sports scientists, we are able to understand the external overload and there is a remedy for that. But whereas the internal overload, since we are not able to read it, the athletes are making problem there only. The performance is going down mostly because of internal overloads. That's why the measuring of the internal overload is very important. How to do that?
Yeah, so it really does come back to that almost relationship with the athlete, because it does come back to some of those objective measures.
Your voice is breaking.
Oh, so it really is comes back to the subjective measures and that relationship building with the athlete. Because
the athlete,
yeah, we've had instances here, say with our rowing team, where there's we know that all of the symptoms, if we want to look at our biochemical markers or we want to look at our subjective measures, we know that they are walking a very fine line in terms of overtraining, but they are performing quite well. So the difficulty as a sports scientist is to be able to, like, if I look at my testosterone cortisol ratio and say it's down 25%, is that too much? Or I can't categorically say 25% is okay, 35% is not okay.
Lot of disturbance.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that noise is coming from.
Okay, my final question to you. You mentioned about the biochemical programs and assessment monitoring and other things regarding rugby. Now, I want to know from you, please explain how the biochemical monitoring during anaerobic lactic, and aerobic activities.
Yeah,
How do you monitor that?
Very, very different. Yeah. So probably, testosterone is permissive in some ways in terms of muscle contractions. It does show non-genomic effects on the ability of the muscle to contract. So it can have this sort of priming ability that's quite separate to its genomic actions or its typical anabolic actions that we think about. It tends to be impacted heavily by large volumes of training. We know that long distance athletes have lesser basal testosterone levels than sprinting and strength and power athletes. So yes, absolutely. What I've talked to you about today is quite context specific. So rugby is a very combative game. You could compare it to maybe some of the martial arts, or boxing, in terms of it is very brutal. So it's in a lot of ways it would be, you can't just take the information I've provided today, unfortunately, and transpose it to an 800-meter runner. But
that's what
at some level, the ability of the body to cope with the training load, and that's a little bit what we saw from Romain Musen's work as well, is that it's if there's unable to have an appropriate biochemical response, then that's probably a good sign that the loading being experienced by that athlete, regardless of the actual external load, is too much.
Doctor, thank you, Doctor, because why I asked you this question, among the participants, I don't think not even one rugby coach in Sports Authority of India. That's the reason, for the benefit of the coaches, those who are involved in anaerobic lactic, and aerobic coaches, this should be very useful for them. That's the reason I asked how to monitor the biochemical in these activities. If you know, you can explain to them so that they will get benefit.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and like I said, it's quite context specific. I would say that some of the athletes there were netball athletes, which I'm sure there's very few coaches there as well from netball, but again, it's a female sport, probably a little bit closer to basketball, volleyball in terms of the anaerobic requirements, much less combative. So yeah, I think there's still some general learnings that can be taken from the context that it has been presented.
Thank you, Dr. Martyn Beaven, for your valuable time. And it's a golden opportunity for us to learn from you. You traveled a lot, and the vast experience will definitely help our Sports of India coaches. And once again, I thank you as well as Sports of India for this beautiful opportunity. Jai Hind. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
Thanks, Stalin.
And yes, of course, thank you, Dr. Saju, for the opportunity as well. I really do appreciate it, and I think it's probably the biggest crowd I've ever had to talk to. So yeah, it's
all right. I think it's already It's late for you in New Zealand. I think 8:15 dinner time. So once again, I thank you so much for having given such a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I would like to wind up the session on, and I request all the coaches to be again come and participate in our next week's session, same day, that is Friday, same time. Thank you one and all. Thank you all for participating. Thanks, Martyn.
Thank you, Dr. Saju.
Okay.